is raging out of control, reaching 4.5%. It's now the highest level since almost 2 decades. Furthermore, the price of the essentials that low-income Canadians require is rising the fastest. For example, housing is up 1/3, as are gas prices. Food is reaching double-digit increases, especially nutritious food. These are the basics. These are not luxuries, and they form a larger part of the budgets of low-income Canadians. This inflation has been very good for the billionaire class. Of course, they've seen their assets inflate in value. But working class wage earners have seen their paychecks under attack. Just today, I published data from the Statistics Canada showing that inflation has risen 2.5 times faster than wages. That's a pay cut. It means your paycheck buys less as a result of things costing more. But it's no surprise. Canada is spending more and making less. More dollars chasing fewer goods and services means higher prices. Trudeau flooded our economy with $400 billion when he ran his monstrous deficit over the previous year. Now, of course, we had to spend in COVID, but we didn't have to have the biggest deficit in the G20. All the other G20 countries had COVID too. Nor did we have to pay people not to work when there was 500,000 vacant jobs and the economy was fully reopened, or pay subsidies to companies that had enough money to pay out dividends to their shareholders and CEOs, or send CERB checks to prisoners, or send checks out even in cases where public servants openly suspected fraud. Nor do we have to go on spending uncontrollably with another $100 billion slush fund, unrelated to COVID and above and beyond previous core spending. Instead, we could simply get our spending back to normal pre-COVID levels and live within our means. But Trudeau has decided to do otherwise. He is spending money we don't have on what we do not need and printing it to pay for it. The result is higher prices for all Canadians. The cost of government is driving up the cost of living. And the very poor and the working class are suffering the most. It reminds us that there's nothing new except what is forgotten. This is the same old story. Pierre Elliott Trudeau ran mega deficits in the 70s and 80s, which he paid for by printing money. He drove up the inflation rate to 12%, its highest level in history. What did that do? It killed jobs. It raised unemployment to 12%, raised interest rates to roughly 20%. It pushed 658,000 people into poverty and raised the suicide rate to its highest level in recorded history. Apparently, the misery of not being able to pay your bills, of losing your home, of potentially becoming homeless was so great that many people could not bear to go on. That is the serious human cost of out-of-control inflation. That's why the Mulroney government in 1991 signed a deal with the Bank of Canada to set a new low inflation target, a target that has been in place for 3 decades since. Before Justin Trudeau came along, it was working quite well. Under Mulroney, Chrétien, Martin, Harper, we followed that target and kept inflation. I wish it had been lower, but at least it was not as high as it had been in the earlier Trudeau era. That deal comes up for renewal every 5 years. Last time it was renewed was in 2016, in October. And that means it will lapse on December 31st. We've heard nothing from the government on whether they will renew the low inflation target. We've heard lots of rumors swirling around about fantasies that Trudeau and Freeland have to use the Bank of Canada to spend on a whole series of their political projects. That is not the job of the Bank of Canada. The bank's job is to keep inflation low. And that is why Conservatives are demanding the government close the floodgates of inflation and renew a low inflation target with the Bank of Canada immediately. We know how to get inflation under control. Stop spending what you don't have and what you don't need. Cancel the $100 billion slush fund. Eliminate other wasteful spending like the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bank that after 5 years has completed not a single solitary infrastructure project. Defund the CBC, which wastes over $1 billion on substandard content that cannot survive in the marketplace because people don't want it. And scour the rest of the government for wasteful spending that we are sure are there after we've seen the government give money away to prisoners, to suspected fraud artists, and attempt to give away $500 million to the We organization after that group paid Trudeau's family over $500,000. Get spending under control, live within your means, and make life more affordable for the Canadian people. And unleash the productive forces of the Canadian economy so that we, instead of creating cash, we start creating the stuff cash buys. In essence, make more, cost less, paychecks, not debt. Thank you very much, and I now welcome your questions.
Thank you. We'll now start the question period. We'll start with one question on the phone. Opérateur, une première question.
Thank you. Merci. We'll now take questions from the telephone lines. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. If you have a question, please press *1 on your device keypad. Si vous désirez poser une question, veuillez s'il vous plaît appuyer sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. You may cancel your question at any time by pressing *2. À ce moment, nous lisons votre question en appuyant sur les étoiles. The first question, la première question, is from Kevin Gallagher of CTV National News. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Poilievre. Next week, the Prime Minister goes to Washington, D.C. to talk with the President of the United States and Mexico. Many countries are struggling with high inflation right now, the United States being one of them. What would you want to hear from the Prime Minister in terms of a strategy that would work across borders to try and bring prices down and make things more affordable?
Well, the first thing is let's stop following the idiotic policy of money printing that has driven inflation higher in other countries. Conservatives reject American-style money printing. We rejected it in the 2008-9 financial crisis. At that time, the Americans started off with this policy of quantitative easing, which is a fancy economist term for printing lots of money to pay for big fat government deficits. And what did they get? A massive increase in the gap between rich and poor, and eventually high levels of inflation. So the first thing we would do as conservatives is don't follow the failed American practice of printing money to pay your bills. It's no wonder America has over 6% inflation. The U.S. government has a massive deficit, and the Federal Reserve is printing money to pay for it. This has been a disaster for the American economy. It has been very good for Wall Street and Washington, but very bad for working class people. Why would we want to replicate here in Canada the enormous gap between the super rich and the working class? Why wouldn't we want to do what we did after the financial crisis, which is protect the paychecks of the people, keep inflation low, balance the budget, and get ourselves on solid ground? So that's the first thing. Learn from the mistakes of our neighbors to the south rather than repeating them. Instead, Trudeau looked south of the border and he said, well, they've got huge deficits, a huge gap between rich and poor, and of course, a rising cost of living. Why don't we bring that up here, he says. And we should have done exactly the opposite. Conservatives know the lessons of economic history, and we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We should do as we did in the 08-09 financial crisis, which is to balance the budget, don't print money, protect the value of the dollar. That's why we had the strongest recovery coming out of the great global recession of all the other countries. The countries that kept spending and borrowing, well, they stayed in recession. The countries that got their books in order succeeded. Secondly, I think Mr. Trudeau has to acknowledge that Chrystia Freeland failed Canada in the USMCA. Chrystia Freeland signed a deal that did not protect Canada from Buy America, did not end the tariffs on softwood lumber, that did not allow us to export our largest export commodity, energy, through the Keystone Pipeline. So in every single economic imperative we had in that agreement, she failed. Unlike Ms. Freeland and Mr. Trudeau, the previous Conservative government succeeded in these areas. We were able to get Barack Obama to provide Canada with an exemption to the Buy America policies. And we were able to get George W. Bush to sign a softwood lumber agreement, which not only lifted the tariffs, but forced America to reimburse Canadians $4 billion of unjust tariffs that it had collected. Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau have done none of those things. In fact, they conceded to Donald Trump and they got nothing in return. It's actually impossible to think of a serious concession they have gotten. All they do when they talk about the Canada-US relationship is take credit for things that Brian Mulroney signed into NAFTA 3 decades before. But they haven't, this government has not secured any major concessions and has had major defeats for our construction companies on Buy America, for our forestry workers on softwood lumber, and of course for our energy workers on the Keystone Pipeline. It's time to go to Washington with a business mind, determined to defend Canadian national interests for a change.
Follow-up?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a follow-up, sure. Mr. Poilievre, do you have an idea of when you think the Bank of Canada should raise interest rates? That's one way to help combat inflation.
No, my criticism of the Bank of Canada has been related to its fiscal policies of printing money to fund government spending. That's what's causing the inflation. They purchased over $300 billion of government debt, enabling Justin Trudeau's out-of-control spending that resulted in the biggest deficit in the G20. And that's now been proven a mistake, as I predicted it would back in May. The result of having a 20% increase in our money supply is that more dollars are chasing fewer goods, driving up prices. And that was a disaster. So I'm going to be watching very carefully to make sure that this government no longer spends printed money, and instead they get their spending under control. What the bigger risk with interest rates, by the way, is that Trudeau's deficits are going to start competing with retail and commercial borrowers, and that Trudeau will drive up interest rates with his deficits. Deficits have been known to drive up interest rates. Why? It's obvious, because they increase the demand for credit. When you increase the demand for anything, you increase the cost. So the way to keep inflation and interest rates low is to get the deficit down. That's the best way to protect consumers and Canadian families from the dangers of higher prices and borrowing costs.
Thank you. And I'll go with the question in the room.
Hi, Stephanie Taylor from the Canadian Press. You talked about defunding the CBC, but that's not what your party is promising. In the election platform, your party said it was going to subject it to a review and didn't say anything about defunding it. So why are you saying something different?
It's not different.
It is different.
Well, you can review and defund.
That's not what your leader committed to on the election trail, and that's not what it said in the platform.
That's the position that we've taken, and it's the position I take, and it's a position I've taken many times, so it should be of no surprise. Now, I think CP does work for CBC, right?
I'm asking you why,
Right.
But your leader did not say anything during the election campaign about defunding it, and neither did your platform. So I'm just trying to understand the discrepancies.
So CBC is a client of CP, right?
I don't think I need to talk about what CP's business model is. I'm just asking why your leader wasn't saying on the campaign trail to defund CBC, and your election platform didn't say that, but now you're saying it is.
Mr. O'Toole has been very clear, and he supports defunding the CBC. He's said that for years. So you can go check the record.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll go back on the phone. Do we have another question?
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur les touches étoile 1 maintenant pour poser votre question. There are no further questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment.
Excellent.
La parole est
Merci
à vous,
beaucoup.
please proceed.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci.